In the first-class cabin of a red-eye to New York, William Hayes, a single father in a worn jacket, gripping his boarding pass, was coldly ordered by flight attendant Vanessa Cole to leave his seat under scrutinizing stares. She believed he couldn't afford first class. Emily clutched her father's hand, lip trembling. William stood, silently accepting humiliation. 1 minute later, Captain Leonard Brooks's voice rang through the cabin. "I need Mr. Hayes immediately." Vanessa went silent, then dropped to her knees. The night had started hours earlier at San Francisco International, where delays stacked up like dominoes in the cold December rain. The gate area swelled with frustrated travelers, their patience worn thin by cancellations and missed connections. William had checked his watch 17 times in the last hour, calculating and recalculating whether they would make Emily's appointment in New York. The appointment that couldn't be rescheduled, the one he'd saved for 8 months to afford. When the gate agent finally called their flight, Emily had looked up at him with those wide brown eyes that still carried traces of her mother's gentle expression, and whispered, "Is this the fancy plane, Daddy?" He'd nodded, unable to trust his voice. This was the first time he'd bought first-class tickets in his life. Not for himself. Never for himself. But Emily deserved one flight where she didn't have to fold herself into a cramped middle seat, where she could stretch out and maybe, just maybe, sleep before the doctors started their tests. The cabin of Flight 742 gleamed with understated wealth. Soft, golden light pooled over seats wide enough to recline into beds. A flight attendant moved through the aisle with a tray of warm towels and champagne in actual glass flutes. The passengers settling into their territories wore the casual confidence of people accustomed to this altitude of comfort. A woman in a charcoal blazer tapped away at her laptop without looking up. A man with silver hair nursed his scotch and closed his eyes. Another passenger, someone Emily would later remember only as the angry lady in the blue scarf, shot them a look of pure irritation when William apologized for needing to squeeze past her to reach their seats. William Hayes was 36 years old, though the last 3 years had carved lines around his eyes that made him look older. His broad shoulders still carried the posture of someone who'd once worked with his hands on complex machinery. But there was a weariness in the way he moved now, the kind that comes from too many sleepless nights and too many decisions made alone. His jacket, a dark gray that had faded to charcoal, showed its age in the worn elbows and the way it hung slightly loose on his frame. His jeans were clean but frayed at the hems. His boots carried the dust of construction sites and repair shops, the kind of honest dirt that doesn't quite wash out. He looked, to the casual observer, exactly like someone who'd wandered into the wrong section of the aircraft. And that was precisely the problem. Emily Hayes carried a purple backpack nearly as big as her torso. Inside it, wrapped carefully in a clean T-shirt, was a small, wooden model airplane her father had built for her on her 6th birthday. She wore her best dress, the navy blue one with white flowers that she'd picked out herself because it made her feel like the girls in the movies. Her hair was pulled back in 2 careful braids, though one was already coming loose. She'd been quiet during the drive to the airport, unnaturally so, and William knew why. Emily had learned, far too young, to read the tension in adult spaces. She'd learned to make herself small when money was tight. She'd learned not to ask for things. And she'd learned, in the year since her mother died, that sometimes the world pushed back for no reason at all. Vanessa Cole was 28 and had been flying for 6 years. She took pride in her work, in the crisp lines of her uniform and the way she could spot potential problems before they escalated. Tonight, she was already on edge. The flight was running late. The head of cabin services had sent a terse message about a VIP passenger in seat 2A who had specific expectations about service standards, and Vanessa had been written up twice in the past 3 months for issues that weren't entirely her fault but had landed on her record nonetheless. She needed this flight to go smoothly. She needed no complications, no drama, no passengers who didn't belong. When William and Emily finally boarded, they were among the last. A gate change had sent them scrambling across the terminal, and Emily's shorter legs had struggled to keep pace. They arrived breathless. William's boarding pass crumpled from being checked and rechecked. As they entered first class, William tried to move quickly, quietly, to get Emily settled without drawing attention. But the cabin had already gone still, with that particular quality of judgment that happens when someone visibly different enters a space that has decided who belongs. The woman in the blue scarf made a small noise of displeasure. "I thought first class was supposed to be quiet," she murmured to her companion. Not quite quietly enough. Vanessa appeared at William's elbow with the smooth efficiency of someone trained to intercept problems. "Good evening," she said, her smile professionally fixed. "May I see your boarding passes?" William handed them over without meeting her eyes. He'd developed a habit of avoiding direct eye contact in situations like this, a small act of self-protection that Emily had started to copy. Vanessa scanned the passes, and something in her expression shifted. The seat assignments were correct, but there was a notation she didn't recognize, a code that marked the tickets as somehow irregular. In that moment, she made a choice. Instead of checking with Amanda Whitmore, the senior flight attendant who would have explained the situation, Vanessa decided to handle it herself. "Sir," she said, her voice rising just slightly. "Just enough. I'm going to need you to step back to your actual cabin." The words landed like stones. William's hand tightened around Emily's. "This is our cabin," he said quietly. "Our seats are, I understand there may have been a system error," Vanessa continued, her tone sharpening with the confidence of someone who believed they were preventing a bigger problem. "But I can't allow you to remain in first class until we verify your ticketing. You'll need to move to the rear of the aircraft. Now, please." She gestured toward the curtain separating first class from the main cabin, as if directing traffic. Emily's small voice cut through the tension. "Daddy?" William knelt down, his face level with hers, and the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. "It's okay, sweetheart," he whispered. "We'll figure it out." But his eyes told a different story. They carried the weight of every time he'd been dismissed, every time someone had looked at his worn clothes and assumed the worst, every time he'd had to swallow his pride for Emily's sake. He stood, gathered their bags, and prepared to walk the length of the cabin under dozens of judging eyes. Emily's chin trembled. A man in seat 3C pulled out his phone and angled it just so. Another passenger smirked behind her hand. Amanda Whitmore emerged from the galley at precisely the wrong moment. She saw William standing, saw Vanessa with her arms crossed, saw the ripple of discomfort spreading through the cabin. "What's happening?" she asked Vanessa directly. Handling a seating issue, Vanessa replied, her voice tight. Amanda's eyes narrowed. She'd been flying for 22 years, and she knew the difference between a genuine problem and a misunderstanding wrapped in assumptions. "Did you verify?" she started to ask, but Vanessa cut her off. "I've got this under control." Amanda looked at William, really looked at him, and saw a father trying to protect his child from humiliation. She saw Emily's trembling lip and the careful way she pressed herself against her father's leg. Something was wrong here. But before Amanda could intervene, before she could ask the right questions, the decision had already been made. William had not always been a man who accepted injustice quietly. There had been a time, not so long ago, when he would have fought back, when he would have demanded to speak to supervisors and pulled out documentation and made absolutely certain that everyone understood he had every right to be exactly where he was. But that was before the hospital bills that multiplied like viruses, before the night Sarah had squeezed his hand one last time and made him promise to take care of Emily, to keep her safe, to be the kind of father who put his daughter's peace above his own pride. Before he'd learned that sometimes the cost of being right was too high when you were trying to protect someone small and scared. 3 years earlier, William Hayes had been a senior aerospace engineer specializing in flight safety systems. He'd worked on projects that most people never heard about, the kind of unglamorous but critical work that kept aircraft functioning when things went wrong at 35,000 feet. He'd consulted on sensor redundancy systems and emergency protocol optimization. He'd testified before the FAA. He'd presented at conferences in Vienna and Singapore. His name appeared on patents that would outlive him. And then Sarah got sick, and the world that had seemed so solid revealed itself to be made of paper. The insurance that was supposed to cover everything covered approximately 60% of everything. The job that promised flexibility demanded he be on site during the exact hours when Sarah needed him most. The colleagues, who'd seemed like friends, slowly stopped calling. William had made his choice without hesitation. He stepped away from the career, from the conferences, from the patents. He became a father who was present, a husband who was there until the very end, and then a single parent who was still figuring out how to be both people at once. In the months after Sarah died, William took whatever work he could find that allowed him to be home when Emily needed him. He repaired HVAC systems. He did electrical work for a contractor who didn't ask questions about his engineering degree. He fixed cars in driveways and installed security systems and said yes to any job that paid in cash and ended by 3 in the afternoon. The savings dwindled. The house went up for sale. They moved to a smaller apartment where Emily's room was barely big enough for her bed and a small bookshelf, but Emily never went to bed scared. She never came home to an empty house, and when the letter arrived about the follow-up appointment in New York, the one that would determine whether the treatment had worked, whether the ghost of her mother's illness had passed her by, William had made another choice. He'd bought the first-class tickets, not as an indulgence, as a gift, as a way of telling his daughter, without words, that she mattered more than money, more than pride, more than anything else in the world. The envelope in William's jacket pocket crinkled slightly as he stood in the aisle, preparing to be escorted out of first class. Inside it was a letter from Northridge Aviation Safety, a consulting firm that had tracked him down 3 weeks ago with an offer. They needed someone with his specific expertise for a new project. The pay was good. The schedule was flexible. The work mattered. He hadn't decided whether to accept. Accepting meant stepping back into a world that had moved on without him, a world where people would ask where he'd been and why he'd left, and whether he was really still sharp enough to keep up. It meant risk, but it also meant stability for Emily, meant college funds and medical coverage and maybe, eventually, a house with a backyard again. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was being kicked out of first class on the same flight where he carried a job offer that would have made first class feel ordinary again. In the cockpit, Captain Leonard Brooks was running through his pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this exact routine 4,312 times before. His co-pilot, a younger man named Marcus Chen, was reviewing weather updates when the first alert pinged on the flight management system. It was minor. A sensor discrepancy in one of the hydraulic pressure monitors, the kind of thing that happened occasionally, usually resolved itself, and fell well within normal parameters. Brooks made a note, checked the backup systems, prepared to monitor it during taxi. Then the second alert appeared. A slight irregularity in the flight control feedback loop, still minor, still within limits, but the combination was unusual enough to warrant attention. "Ground maintenance is on frequency," Marcus said. "Want me to get them?" Brooks nodded, but the radio connection was spotty, fighting through the interference of the storm system that had been delaying flights all evening. The maintenance supervisor's voice kept cutting out mid-sentence. Brooks made a decision. He would delay pushback until he had clear confirmation that the alerts were purely informational and not symptomatic of something deeper. As he reached for the cabin intercom to inform the flight attendants, his eyes caught on the passenger manifest displayed on the tablet mounted to his left. The system had been updated recently to flag passengers with specific credentials or backgrounds, a security measure implemented after several incidents where having the right expertise on board had prevented disasters. And there, highlighted in pale blue, was a name Brooks recognized. William Hayes, Flight Safety Engineer, former consultant on the exact type of sensor system currently throwing alerts. Brooks sat back in his seat. The odds were astronomical. But then again, he'd been flying long enough to know that sometimes the universe arranged itself in statistically improbable ways for a reason. "Get me Mr. Hayes," he said to Marcus. "Now." The intercom crackled to life just as William reached the curtain dividing first class from the main cabin. Captain Brooks's voice filled the cabin with the kind of authority that makes people instinctively straighten in their seats. "This is your captain. I need Mr. William Hayes to remain in his current location. This is a safety-related request." The cabin went silent. Vanessa Cole froze mid-step, her hand still outstretched toward the curtain. The passengers who had been watching William's humiliation with varying degrees of smugness or pity suddenly looked confused. Emily pressed closer to her father's side. William closed his eyes for just a moment, a flicker of something between relief and resignation crossing his face. He'd known, on some level, that his presence on this flight might not go unnoticed. He'd hoped it would. Captain Brooks emerged from the cockpit, his uniform crisp, his expression serious. He was a man in his early 50s with steel-gray hair and the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. He walked directly to William, ignoring the curious stares of every passenger in first class, and extended his hand. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "thank you for being on this flight. I need your expertise." The shift in the cabin's atmosphere was immediate and total. The woman in the blue scarf looked suddenly very interested in the magazine on her lap. The man who'd been filming lowered his phone. Vanessa's face had gone pale. Amanda stepped forward, her voice low but sharp. "Vanessa, my office," after landing. But Vanessa couldn't move. She was staring at William, at the boarding pass she'd dismissed, at the little girl whose hand he held, and understanding was crashing over her like cold water. This wasn't a man who'd scammed his way into first class. This wasn't someone taking advantage of a system error. This was someone she'd humiliated based on nothing more than the age of his jacket and the dust on his boots. William knelt down next to Emily one more time. "I need to help the captain for a few minutes," he said gently. "You stay right here, okay?" Emily nodded, her eyes wide. William looked up at Amanda, who immediately understood. "I'll make sure she's comfortable," Amanda said, and there was steel in her voice that suggested anyone who looked at Emily sideways would regret it. William followed Captain Brooks to the cockpit entrance, where they spoke in low, technical terms that most passengers wouldn't understand, but that conveyed respect between professionals. "Hydraulic pressure monitor and flight control feedback both flagging," Brooks explained. "Probably nothing, but the combination is unusual. You worked on the Sentry 7 system, didn't you?" William nodded. "What's your baseline pressure reading?" The conversation continued, diagnosis and analysis flowing between them with the ease of shared language. In first class, the silence stretched uncomfortably. The passengers who had judged William moments before were now forced to confront their assumptions. A man in seat 1D, a tech executive who'd flown first class every week for the past decade, leaned toward his colleague. "I think that's William Hayes," he murmured. He was on the team that redesigned the backup sensor protocols after the Denver incident. His colleague's eyes widened. The Denver incident had been national news, a near disaster averted by better safety systems. We assumed the executive started, then stopped, because finishing that sentence would require acknowledging exactly what they'd assumed and why. Vanessa stood rooted to the spot, her professional composure crumbling. She'd been trained to handle difficult passengers, medical emergencies, even evacuations. But she'd never been trained for the moment when you realize you've become the villain in someone else's story. Amanda appeared at her elbow. "He purchased those tickets," she said quietly, each word deliberate. "He's been saving for 8 months. His daughter has a medical appointment in New York. The code you didn't understand?" It indicated he'd specifically requested seats with extra privacy because Emily gets anxious in crowds. Vanessa's breath caught. "I didn't. You didn't ask," Amanda finished. "You saw a man who didn't look like he belonged, and you made a decision based on that. Do you understand what you've done?" William returned from the cockpit after 12 minutes. He'd identified the source of the alerts, a calibration drift in the pressure transducer that was creating false discrepancies between redundant systems. Nothing dangerous, but something that needed to be logged and monitored, and something that would have required delaying the flight for at least an hour if ground maintenance had to diagnose it from scratch. Brooks had thanked him with the kind of gratitude that's reserved for people who've just saved everyone a massive headache. As William walked back down the aisle, the cabin had transformed. The passengers who'd watched him being dismissed now watched his return with something between curiosity and shame. Emily was sitting in her seat, Amanda beside her, playing a quiet game with a deck of cards from the galley. When Emily saw her father, her face lit up with relief. Vanessa was waiting. She'd positioned herself in the aisle, and when William approached, she did something that made the entire cabin hold its breath again. She knelt down. Not a slight bend, not a token gesture. She went to her knees on the carpet of the aircraft, her eyes level with Emily's. "I owe you an apology," Vanessa said, and her voice cracked on the words. "I made a terrible mistake. I judged your dad without knowing anything about him. I made you feel like you didn't belong here, and I'm sorry." Emily looked at her father, uncertain. William's jaw was tight, but when he spoke, his voice was measured. "You need to apologize to her," he said, nodding toward Emily. "She's the one you scared." Vanessa turned fully to Emily, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "I'm sorry I made you feel afraid," she said. "You deserve to be treated with respect. You and your dad both do." "I was wrong." Emily studied Vanessa's face for a long moment, her 7-year-old mind processing something that many adults never fully grasp, that people can make terrible mistakes and still be capable of genuine remorse. "You won't make other kids scared?" Emily asked softly. "Not ever again," Vanessa promised. Emily considered this, then nodded solemnly. "Okay." Captain Brooks's voice came over the intercom one more time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've resolved a minor technical matter thanks to the expertise of one of our passengers. We'll be pushing back shortly. I want to remind everyone that on this aircraft, we treat each other with dignity and respect. No exceptions." The weight of his words settled over the cabin like a benediction and a warning in equal measure. The flight itself was uneventful in the way that flights should be. Emily fell asleep somewhere over Kansas, her head resting against William's shoulder, her small hand still clutching the armrest. William stayed awake, his mind turning over the events of the evening. The job offer in his pocket felt heavier now, more possible. Not because of what had happened, but because of how he'd handled it. He'd protected Emily. He'd maintained his dignity. He'd helped when he was needed. And maybe, he thought, he could step back into that old version of himself without losing the new version he'd become. Maybe there was room for both. Amanda checked on them 3 times during the flight, bringing warm cookies for Emily and coffee for William that he accepted with quiet thanks. Vanessa stayed in the galley for most of the journey, though William saw her watching them once. Her expression haunted. He knew that look. It was the look of someone who just learned something about themselves they couldn't unlearn. The trouble started before they landed. Someone had taken video of the initial confrontation, and it had reached social media while they were still in the air. By the time Flight 742 touched down at JFK, the clip had been viewed 40,000 times. The comments section was a battlefield. Half the viewers condemned Vanessa as a classist monster. The other half defended her, claiming she'd been following procedure. A few people recognized William from industry publications and added context. But the narrative had already begun to solidify into something simpler and angrier than the truth. The airline's public relations team was waiting at the gate with the kind of forced smiles that telegraph panic. They introduced themselves to William with studied casualness, suggested that perhaps they could have a conversation in a private lounge, mentioned that, of course, the airline wanted to ensure his complete satisfaction with the travel experience. William looked down at Emily, who was yawning and dragging her purple backpack. "My daughter has an appointment we can't miss," he said simply. "We can talk later." The PR representative's smile tightened. "Of course. But perhaps we could arrange a car for you, as a courtesy?" He walked past them, Emily's hand in his, and disappeared into the terminal crowd. The meeting happened 4 days later, after Emily's appointment had gone well, after William had called the airline and agreed to hear them out. They met in a nondescript conference room in Midtown, the kind of space that's designed to convey importance while remaining forgettable. The airline sent 3 representatives, a vice president of customer experience, a lawyer, and the head of public relations. They came prepared with a settlement offer, a non-disclosure agreement, and talking points about how much the airline valued his patronage. William let them make their pitch. Then he slid a single piece of paper across the table. "These are my requirements," he said. The room went quiet as they read. William wasn't asking for money. He was demanding change. A formal written apology addressed to Emily, acknowledging that she'd been made to feel unwelcome through no fault of her own. A mandatory training program for all flight crew on implicit bias and de-escalation, with specific emphasis on protecting the dignity of families. A company-wide policy protecting minors from being filmed or having their images shared without parental consent during incidents on aircraft. And finally, a commitment that Vanessa Cole would not be fired or scapegoated, but rather given the opportunity to help design and implement the new training program. The lawyer started to object. "Mr. Hayes, surely you understand that we can't commit to, then we have nothing to discuss," William interrupted. "You're worried about your brand. I'm worried about every other family who might face what we faced. Those are my terms." The vice president of customer experience, a woman named Patricia Chen, who'd been mostly silent until now, leaned forward. "The last item," she said. "You want us to keep Miss Cole employed?" "I want you to let her learn from this," William clarified. "She made a mistake. A bad one. But she owned it. She apologized to my daughter on her knees in front of a cabin full of people. That takes courage. You want to fix your culture? You start by showing people they can acknowledge their mistakes without losing everything." The meeting lasted another 90 minutes. The lawyer pushed back. The PR head tried to negotiate. Patricia Chen listened, asked questions, and eventually said something that changed the tone of the entire conversation. "You're asking us to be better than we are," she observed. "Yes," William agreed. "Is that a problem?" Patricia smiled faintly. "No. It's refreshing. Give us 24 hours. The call came the next afternoon. The airline had accepted all 4 requirements. Vanessa Cole would become the face of the new training initiative, sharing her story as a cautionary tale and a case study in recovery. Emily's apology letter would arrive by courier. The policy changes would be announced within 6 weeks. And in a move that wasn't on William's list but that Patricia Chen insisted on adding, the airline would establish a fund for families dealing with medical travel expenses. They'd call it the Hayes Family Travel Assistance Program. 6 months later, William and Emily were preparing for another trip. William had accepted the job at Northridge Aviation Safety, and it had turned out to be everything he'd hoped for: challenging work, reasonable hours, colleagues who respected both his expertise and his priorities as a father. Emily's health remained stable. The apartment was still small, but they were saving again, building toward something bigger. When they arrived at the airport for a quick trip to visit Sarah's parents, they went through security and headed toward their gate. The flight was full, so William had booked economy. He didn't mind. Neither did Emily, who'd already pulled out her book and was lost in a story about dragons. As they waited to board, a familiar face appeared. Vanessa Cole was working the gate, checking boarding passes and answering questions with a warmth that seemed more genuine than before. When she saw William and Emily, she froze for just a fraction of a second, then approached them slowly. "Mr. Hayes," she said, quietly. "Emily, I wasn't sure if I'd see you again." "We fly sometimes," William said neutrally. Vanessa nodded. She looked different, less polished, maybe, but more real. "I wanted you to know," she said, "that the training program is making a difference. We've had crews tell me it changed how they see passengers. And she paused, gathering courage. "I think about what I did every single day. I'm grateful you gave me the chance to make it right." Emily looked up from her book. "Are you still making people scared?" Vanessa knelt down, that same gesture from 6 months ago. "I'm trying very hard not to," she said seriously. "And when I mess up, I'm learning to say sorry the right way." Emily considered this, then reached into her backpack and pulled out a small drawing. It was a crayon picture of an airplane with 3 people standing in front of it, holding hands. "I made this after our trip," Emily said. "You can have it." Vanessa accepted the drawing with shaking hands. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll keep it forever." They boarded separately. William and Emily found their seats in row 27, wedged between a businessman and a college student. The seats were narrow. The legroom was minimal. Emily had to share an armrest. And none of it mattered, because halfway through the flight, Emily looked up at her father and said, "Dad, that lady learned something, didn't she?" William smiled. "Yes, she did." "Good," Emily said, satisfied. "Everybody should keep learning, even grown-ups." She returned to her book, completely unaware that she'd just articulated something profound. William looked out the window at the clouds below, thinking about the journey that had brought them here. About Sarah, who would have been proud of how he'd handled everything. About the job that let him use his skills while still being present. About the small ways that standing up for dignity could ripple outward and change things. About the fact that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to destroy someone who's wronged you, but to insist they become better. Somewhere in the front of the cabin, another family was boarding, their clothes worn, their child clutching a stuffed animal. William watched as the flight attendant greeted them with genuine warmth, helped them find space for their bags, and made sure the child was comfortable. He didn't know if that attendant had gone through the new training, but he saw the care in her actions, the absence of judgment, the basic respect that should have always been the standard. And he felt something settle in his chest, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they'd left the world a little better than they'd found it. Not through grand gestures or public crusades, but through insisting on dignity, through refusing to let humiliation be the end of the story, through believing that people could change, and then giving them the chance to prove it. Emily fell asleep with her head on his shoulder, her breathing soft and steady. William closed his eyes, feeling the gentle vibration of the engines, the subtle shift of the aircraft through the sky. They were 35,000 feet above the earth, surrounded by strangers, held aloft by physics and faith and the careful work of people who built safety into every rivet and wire. And for now, in this moment, that was enough. The world below was complicated. It was often unfair. It held pain and loss and the constant struggle to protect the people you loved. But it also held second chances. It held people who could learn. It held daughters who drew pictures of forgiveness. It held the possibility that sometimes, when someone falls to their knees, they might stand up different. Better. And that was worth fighting for. That was worth saving for. That was worth everything.